In the long, shadowed corridors of English history, few deaths are as unsettling or as shrouded in mystery as that of King Edward II. According to whispers passed down through centuries, he was murdered not by poison or sword, but by a red-hot iron rod inserted into his rectum, a method so cruel, so specific, that many have wondered, was it real or a myth born of vengeance and scandal? The choice of weapon was no accident. It was meant to kill without leaving a single mark on the outside of the body. No wound, no blood, no proof, only pain, silence, and a death that would terrify anyone who dared look too closely. Officially, Edward II was said to have died of natural causes while under house arrest in 1327, but nothing about his reign nor his downfall was natural. He was once the most powerful man in England. Then abandoned, imprisoned, deposed, and finally eliminated in a way that defies belief. But why? What could drive an entire court to allow such a gruesome fate? And more importantly, was it even true? Because what if the red-hot poker was just the beginning of something far more chilling? What if the real mystery was not how Edward died, but whether he ever died at all? Let's pull back the veil on one of history's most brutal royal enigmas, and begin at the moment England lost not just a king, but its sense of order. The hammer and the harp, two kings, one throne. To understand the strange fall of Edward II, we must look at the giant who came before him. His father, Edward I, was not just a king, he was a legend. They called him the Hammer of the Scots. He led armies across Britain and France. He conquered Wales. He built castles with walls of stone and policies of iron. He ruled with fear, with discipline, with a mind made for war and a heart made for command. Under Edward I, England did not just survive, it thrived. So when the throne passed to his son, hope was high, but the crown did not mold the son into the father. It exposed the cracks already inside him. Edward II had the physique of a ruler, tall, strong, broad-shouldered, but inside he was different. Where his father was cold and calculating, Edward was emotional. Where his father ruled through power, Edward sought comfort. He ignored the lessons of statecraft and spent his days with ditch diggers, masons, and minstrels. He preferred the company of commoners over nobles. He laughed too easily, trusted too freely, and loved too recklessly. He didn't study war or law, he studied people, and he often misread them. To the English nobility, this was not just eccentric, it was dangerous. A king who couldn't command respect was worse than no king at all. But Edward didn't seem to care. He formed bonds with those he favored, men who were charming, bold, and often unqualified. He gave them titles. He gave them power. And through those gifts, he made enemies. Perhaps he believed loyalty could be bought with affection. Perhaps he believed love was stronger than law. But in a medieval court, nothing was more fragile than a king without fear. And Edward II was about to learn that the hard way. The favorite that changed a kingdom. Among all the companions in Edward II's life, none cast a shadow as long as Piers Gaveston. He was not a prince, not a general, not even the son of a great lord, but he was bold, charming, and dangerous in ways Edward could never see. They met as teenagers at court. From that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A connection too deep to explain and too strong to break. To Edward, Gaveston was more than a friend. He was comfort, he was escape. He was the one person who made him feel powerful without needing to be feared. But Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, saw what his son could not. He recognized Gaveston as a threat, not because of politics, but because of influence. He exiled Gaveston from court. He tried to sever the bond before it could rot the crown. But when Edward II became king in 1307, his very first act was to bring Gaveston back, not just as a guest, but as Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in the realm. To the nobility, it was unthinkable. Cornwall was a title reserved for royalty, and now it belonged to a man they saw as a parasite. During Edward's coronation, Queen Isabella stood at his side, but the king's gaze never met hers. Instead, it rested on Gaveston. Even the royal wedding gifts, treasures of state, were given not to Isabella but to his favorite. The court was stunned. The whispers turned to outrage. Were they lovers? No document ever confirms it. But one chronicler wrote that Edward loved Gaveston more than any woman. True or not, the damage was done. The Lord saw Gaveston as a toxin in the king's blood, and worse, Gaveston mocked them openly. He gave them cruel nicknames. He laughed at their power. He insulted their honor. It was more than they could bear. The nobility united, and Edward was given a choice: exile Gaveston or face civil war. Reluctantly, Edward sent his favorite to Ireland. But absence only fueled his longing. Soon, Edward found a way to bring him back, and when Gaveston returned, they made no attempt to hide their defiance. Not from the court, not from the queen, not even from God. The stage was set. What began as affection was now treason in the eyes of the realm, and Gaveston's fall would be only the beginning. When Piers Gaveston was executed in 1312, Edward II was shattered, but grief did not bring wisdom. It brought something worse. In the void Gaveston left behind, a new figure rose, Hugh Despenser the Younger. He was clever. Ambitious, and unlike Gaveston, he didn't crave affection. He craved control. Despenser wormed his way into the king's trust. He whispered advice. He seized titles, and slowly he became the shadow behind the throne. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, joined in the ascent. Together, they built a web of influence that stretched across England. Lands were stolen, enemies were silenced, and power concentrated around the Despenser name like a tightening fist. The nobility seethed. They had tolerated Gaveston, but the Despensers were something else entirely: calculated, ruthless, and insatiable. Among those watching in silence was Queen Isabella. She had endured humiliation during the Gaveston years. She had smiled through betrayal, but now even her patience began to burn. And then Edward made his gravest mistake. In 1314, he led an army to Scotland to reclaim lost honor. It ended in disaster. At the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce crushed the English. Edward's army panicked. His strategy failed. And as thousands died, the king fled the battlefield. He abandoned his men. He abandoned his crown. And with that, his image collapsed. No longer a king in the eyes of the people, just a coward in royal robes. But back in court, the Despensers thrived. They seized lands from their rivals. They punished dissent. They reshaped the kingdom in their own name, and Edward let them. He was no longer a ruler. He was a prisoner of his own need to be loved. But Isabella had not forgotten, and she would not forgive. In 1325, she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. Her brother, King Charles IV, demanded homage from Edward. But Edward, under Despenser's influence, refused to go. So Isabella went in his place, and when she arrived, she made a decision that would change history. She would not return, not while Hugh Despenser lived. Not while Edward still wore the crown. In exile, she found an unlikely ally, Roger Mortimer, once a nobleman, now a fugitive. Together, they planned a quiet storm, a rebellion, not of swords and banners, but of hearts and loyalty. And in 1326, they came back. In September of 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer returned to England. They brought with them only a small army, but they didn't need numbers. They had something far more powerful: the will of a broken kingdom. From town to town, people welcomed them, not as invaders, but as liberators. The Despensers were hated, the king was despised, and the rebellion moved like wildfire. Edward II and Hugh Despenser fled. They ran west, hoping to find allies, but England had already turned its back. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured and executed in Bristol. His son was hunted down and met a fate so gruesome it chilled the realm. He was hanged, disemboweled, and quartered, his body parts scattered as warning. As for Edward, he was seized and taken to Kenilworth Castle. no longer king, no longer feared, just a man, alone with his regrets. In January of 1327, Parliament did what had never been done before. They deposed a reigning monarch. Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. But his story did not end there. He was sent to Berkeley Castle, placed under guard, officially for his safety, unofficially to disappear, and then came the silence. No letters, no visitors, no voice from behind those stone walls. Until the announcement came. September 21st, 1327, Edward II was dead. But how? The records say nothing. No illness, no wound, just dead. And that's when the rumors began. Some say it was done at night. While the castle slept, two men entered his chamber. They held him down and inserted a red-hot iron rod into his rectum. There would be no blood, no visible mark, nothing for the world to see, but the pain unimaginable. The message undeniable. This was punishment. This was erasure. This was a warning cloaked in silence. Even the castle account book confirmed only a vague entry. No witness was named. No doctor signed the report. And the man who owned the castle, Lord Thomas de Berkeley, was absent that night. When Edward's body was prepared for burial, it was sealed in waxed cloth. No one saw his face. No one saw his skin. Just a coffin, just a memory. Just a question that still haunts history. Did Edward II truly die in that room, or did something even stranger happen next? The death of Edward II was meant to end a chapter, but instead it opened a deeper mystery. Because not everyone believed the king had truly died, whispers spread across Europe, not of a corpse, but of a man still breathing. Still waiting, still watching. 3 years after his supposed death, something strange happened. Edmund, Earl of Kent, and Edward's own half-brother, was caught plotting to rescue him. But rescue him from where? Edward was dead, buried, mourned. So why would a member of the royal family risk everything for a ghost? Edmund was executed for treason, and the court insisted it had all been a trap, set by Roger Mortimer to flush out loyalists. But that explanation raised even more questions. Why set a trap unless the rumor held some truth? And then came a letter, written years later. It claimed Edward had escaped, fled to Europe, and lived out his days as a monk in obscurity. Some say he made it to Italy. Others say he joined the Knights Hospitaller, but no proof ever surfaced. Only fragments, only rumors. Only the unsettling fact that no one, not even those closest to him, ever saw the body. Was the hot iron real, or a myth born from guilt and fear? Was the coffin empty? Or did it carry a man still barely alive, silenced forever by cloth and wax? We may never know. History has a way of closing its doors quietly, but sometimes, if you listen close enough, you can still hear what was never said. A king deposed, a body never shown, and a question that refuses to die. What really happened to Edward II? Was he murdered in darkness, or did he vanish into it? You decide.